Okay. It doesn't seem to be allowing me to assign.
A lot of people are not able to get in again like last time. So, but Lucille's in there, so hopefully she'll.
Let's see.
And there are a bunch of people in there for the presentation too, so it could be any one of them.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. We're so pleased that you joined us. Today, we'll kick off our session, which is focused on family data to inform homeschool communication and collaboration within PBIS. I'm Andy Garbitz. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm very pleased to be here to help facilitate this session on behalf of our presenters, Adam Feinberg, Sarah Pfeffer, and Chris Vatland. You can go to the next slide, Adam. So I first just want to address a few features of our virtual session. This slide is probably now familiar to many of you. So this slide depicts just some of our expectations for the chat and polls and our time together today. Feel free to add questions and comments to the chat that are topical and within our theme. We look forward to your interaction with us as the panelists, as well as your interaction with each other. You can go to the next slide. You can use the chat to engage with other participants or share your thoughts and questions with presenters. You can find the question and answer section under polls. Feel free to add any questions you have for presenters in response to the Q&A poll. We'll compile those questions and comments shared and address those during the discussion components of today's session. If you navigate away from the session and would like to return, you can click the Join Meeting button to get back in. And if you need support at any time, you can go to the Help Desk tab at the top of your screen within Pathable. Our session today is part of the Family and Student Voice strand. If you haven't been able to view the other two sessions in this strand today, you can view the recordings within Pathable later today or at another later time. Here are a few guiding questions you might consider during this session. For example, you might think through how the topics we share today compare to your priorities and how you would like to align and integrate aspects of family-school collaboration within your existing systems. Now, I'll transition back to our session, which again will focus on using family data to inform homeschool communication and collaboration within PBIS. Here are our learning objectives for today's session. At the conclusion of this session, we hope that you will be able to describe approaches to collaborate and communicate with families, understand how to use family school data to inform actions, and explain proactive and positive approaches to communicate with families and promote family school collaboration. We wanted to focus on communication and collaboration specifically because across studies examining family school interventions, we see that effective communication and collaboration among families and educators are among the most effective ways to support student social, emotional, and behavior competencies. By focusing on obtaining data about and from families, we're able to center on family and student voice to maximize the impact of our communication and collaboration strategies. We have 3 exemplar presentations today. First, Adam Feinberg will describe building family school connections. Next, Sarah Pfeffer will share a strategy for promoting family school partnerships. And finally, Chris Fatland will present on family engagement and support for behavior at Tier 3. So I'm now very pleased to turn it over to Adam Feinberg.
Great. Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that setup. So I'm going to speak a little bit around the work we've been doing in Massachusetts, which I'm always happy to share our work. It's very exciting. I learned so much from you all. The last session I got so much out of. If you haven't had a chance to be in that session, I really strongly encourage you to watch the recording of it later on tonight. Thank you to my co-presenters, Andy, Sarah, and Chris. I'm excited to be working with you all and actually learn from you all. So I'm going to take a kind of more of a universal practices, a Tier 1 approach, and kind of talk about the work we've been doing in Massachusetts around helping build family school connections within our academy. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the academy in general, so you kind of understand the context of which our work is in. And then I'm going to kind of speak to a little bit more of our school family integration efforts that we've been doing, and then go more into the family school survey results that we've been integrating within our work, thanks to the help of Andy and folks. So without further ado, so the state of Massachusetts reached out to us at UConn several years ago to kind of help with building the PBS framework across many schools in the state. It was really focusing on, our work really focuses on Tier 1 and Tier 2. Back then, it still really does focus on Tiers 1 and 2. We have work to do around a Tier 3 work, and we're going to be doing that. We look forward to that. But the work that I'm going to be talking about really is going to focus more on our Tier 1 today in this talk. Also, a unique aspect of the work we do really focuses on the schools that have been identified by the state as underperforming. Generally, the state, so the team that I work with at the state of Massachusetts focuses on turnaround and how to help support those schools that maybe they're based on certain data sources need a little more support. So that is the majority of schools and districts that participate, but it's not exclusive. And we do have some schools and districts participate that, according to the data, are doing kind of just fine. But just get a sense of the great majority of our schools that are more high needs districts. So it is, in our Tier 1 work, it is a 3-year support process. This slide is a little bit, kind of shows kind of how we're viewing it in our current context, considering COVID, which year 1 that we're in for the schools that are just starting with us, and actually all of our schools are doing virtual support. Outside of a COVID situation, we have done a lot more in-person support, especially with actually all of our events. So we are actually very excited. One silver lining of this pandemic is that hopefully we can learn how to really benefit from more virtual support and how to make it actually more accessible, fingers crossed, right? So, but I think what's important to share around the work that we do and the multi-year 3 years of support that we provide to our schools and districts is that there's 4 layers of support, which you can see there under the years 1, 2, and 3. And that's basically, we provide team trainings, coaches meetings, school-based technical assistance, and training. We also provide Swiss support for data system and training, as well as district coordinator support. So now that I think about it, that is 5. So we added that other one on, which is important. But with each of those, as you can see, that there is this layers of support, not to only to kind of help with delivering content, but also help support the implementation, database decision-making, and sustainability of this work. So as you can see, the attendees as well, we really try and make sure that we are supporting not only the team members, but the coaches and district support staff. So this might be very similar to state efforts in your neck of the woods, but just to get a glimpse of how it works in Massachusetts. Also to get a sense of how our system works differently. So this is 3 years all on tier 1. You know, remember we're supporting schools that kind of are a little more in turnaround. So because of that, and again, we have 3 full years with them, which is really amazing and exciting gift. We really focus year 1 on readiness and building. So we kind of go through quick overviews, really understanding foundational content, really kind of building their system, do some work on a lot of work on classroom supports, and then kind of end the year with functional behavior and de-escalation strategies, and hope that in year 2, they move towards the ability to actually start rolling things out and the implementation process. During that year, we do a little bit of kind of, because it's that awkward stage when you're first kind of rolling the PBS framework out, we do a little bit more of kind of focus on equity, integration alignment, classroom supports, and kind of that kind of alignment with more advanced tiers. So with that, you know, that's that kind of first year. And then at the 3rd year, we're hoping that they kind of have their sea legs, for lack of a better metaphor. But we're really kind of looking at year 3 as that year that it's probably best that they get a sense of who, of what the other schools are doing, and kind of do more share and compare. So we have wonderful guest speakers, of which one is with us today, Sarah Pfeffer. We focus on areas of cultural responsiveness and school climate, and family engagement and sustainability. So that's how you can kind of get a good sense of kind of how we support the schools across the three years. Okay. So in addition to that, to get a better sense, we've had 7 cohorts across the past 7 years, obviously, serving a total of 53 districts within the state of Massachusetts, and a total of 170 total schools. This is just the tier 1 academy only. We do also have supported schools and districts in our tier 2 academy as well. So, but we've supported a number of schools across the state. Okay, so to get a sense of how we track progress and how we kind of help with support, you can get a sense of the district leadership capacity measures we use to help kind of build our action planning process at the district level, our school level fidelity tools, as you can see, as the TFI and the TIC, which you may be familiar with. And then we look at school outcome data, which we have a number of different kind of metrics we kind of look at. And then, as always, as I'm sure that many of your other state models use, we have social validity data with our training evaluation data. So we look at all of these to help kind of understand how the system is doing. We always had a family engagement measure, but we didn't really look at it the previous version as well. And then when we saw the great work that Andy was doing, we kind of reached out to Andy and be like, hey, we really like your family school practices survey. Could we kind of learn a little bit more? And then we collaborated, and with that collaboration, we're able to kind of enhance this piece. So really excited about the work in this. So I'm gonna really just quickly highlight kind of this piece now. So with this, with an outcome of that collaboration in the 2019-2020 school year, last year, we were able to kind of roll out a better braided version of family engagement work. So it was really exciting for us, and which included this family school practices survey. We kind of updated our content, so it's much more integrated throughout our academy instead of just a standalone module. And so and then in the spring of each year, we asked the school teams to look at the family school practices survey, kind of use the survey and try and help build that into their action planning. So again, these are all the schools that are participating regardless of year. So we want them to engage in this in the first year, the second year, and the third year, okay? So hopefully schools, you know, in the sense of year one will engage with this, and schools that are in their second year would engage with this. And hopefully over time, we can kind of help them look at whether they have made improvements over time. And that's something that we're excited to start looking at, especially kind of this year. Unfortunately, COVID kind of impacted a lot of this kind of work, but we are still trying to include this within our modules and work because it's actually more important than ever, right? So the data that I'm going to share is basically, we've collected over kind of a year and a half. And so in this next slide, so we have about 82 schools actually completed the survey. So that's what I'm going to show next, and how this is subdivided into the subdomains of the family school practices survey. So thank you, Andy, for sharing that link. I saw that. So you can kind of get access to this as well. So with this, as you notice here, you can notice that in place is in the blue, not in place is in the green, and then that kind of in between aqua color is partially in place. One thing that I'm hoping that is important here is that schools actually, what we're noticing is that schools really don't have a lot in place. And so this is something that we were noticing that we need to kind of focus more on in this general area, in one area in particular. And that was the decision-making and shared ownership. As you can see, the in-place numbers were around 13, low, like, 10, 20%, but shared decision-making and ownership was closer to 4%. So that's something that is kind of important here, especially in light of racial equity and how we really want to make sure that not only are we kind of having that bidirectional sharing of information, we're also having a seat at the table and a voice of all of our families, of each and every families, especially the important groups, the subgroups that we want to make sure have a seat at that table. So that's one thing that we noticed. And so that's one thing that we really need to kind of build in a little bit more within the work that we are doing. So this is where kind of like this data have been really helpful. I was also kind of curious, and so this is kind of a stretch with data, but did any of the schools take it twice, and was there any change? So when I looked at our data, and because of COVID, we weren't able to, a lot of the work kind of shut down for the spring months last year when we typically completed this work. So not all the schools completed it twice, but 4 school teams did. And so I was able to kind of look at the 4 school teams that did this. So this is a very small sample size. So take that with a grain of salt. But I'm just trying to see what we can learn a little bit. And but the initial date, they took this was June of 2019, and then the second date was March. So they kind of took it right, right around those trainings when COVID was hitting and having like our first kind of big impact, especially in the Massachusetts area. So we have some data that we're looking at. And so it's really interesting to see what kind of outcomes we had. And what we noticed is just sharing this data and using these data. So if you look at those subdomains still, what you'll notice is that communication went up a little bit. Information around school and family activities, we saw increases as well. That's where the area probably, other than resources, we're probably the second largest growth rate. Again, what we notice is that decision-making and shared ownership had no change. And that's something that we want to make sure that we target better. And so having these data is really helpful for us to make sure we make changes in the way that we structure our content in our kind of coaching support and technical assistance, to make sure that we are helping our schools really consider and get different ideas. And that's what I was really excited to see the presentation before this. They have such a wonderful ideas of how to make sure folks are sitting at that table, their families are giving feedback around the different plans. And, you know, they're really integrated into kind of looking at data and making decisions on how that tier 1 system looks. And that's so key. So, okay, so lastly, final thoughts. Some major ideas that I think are takeaways from what we've learned is that it's really important to be planful about how we support districts around including families. So having a tool like the Family School Practices Survey can really help with that. You know, making sure they have time to look at these data and schedule times to really sit down and plan around engaging with and supporting with families and including them, and making sure that they're have that kind of checklist or survey to ensure that they're really covering and addressing all the different areas, you know, and making sure they receive in areas that they need additional support around, you know, making sure they're organizing our professional development or coaching our technical assistance around supporting our schools in this. So, so it's really key. And if I can highlight again that shared decision-making and ownership, I would, I know for us, that's something that is something that we are an area that we need to grow, but I'm hoping for you all are kind of really focusing on that as well, because it's such an important piece. So thank you. That's all I had to share. So I'm gonna pass it over to Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much, Adam. That was wonderful. So I'm Sarah Pfeffer. Thank you so much for having me here today. This is actually my first time participating in the PBIS Leadership Forum. So thank you for having me. I'm here to talk about positive parent contact, a tier 2 strategy for promoting family school partnership. So my plan for today is to first introduce you to the basic components of the intervention, this specific strategy and the why behind it. And then I'll share some initial pilot data from some research that we've done on this specific intervention. Next. So as we know, there are wonderful positive outcomes associated with connecting the school and the family context. However, efforts to engage parents often neglect to consider the reinforcement needed to encourage and sustain family participation. In schools, we often ask families if they can do things for us, rather than trying to support them and help the schools do things for families. Additionally, we most often focus our family engagement and family school partnership efforts on the school level, whereas parents often report wanting to know more about their child's classroom and having more information from their child's teacher about their child's learning and behavior in the classroom context. A lot of these typical ways of engaging families have very high demand on families with little emphasis on reciprocal benefit or on reinforcement for families specifically. And as we may know, many families have experienced unproductive or negative interactions with schools, which can then make future engagement efforts aversive or much less likely to happen in the future. This can include communications about student behavior. We often talk to families saying, the only time I hear from the school is when my student gets in trouble. So this intervention is really about flipping that script. And we need strategies to proactively build communication patterns and trust with families in order to partner with caregivers in evidence-based interventions within our PBIS systems and beyond. Next. So let me introduce you to the big ideas behind this intervention strategy, which I call positive parent contact, or PPC. So the image on this slide is all about the main premise behind this. We want it to be the simplest intervention with the lowest demand possible for schools and for families, with very high reinforcement by focusing only on positive behavior as much as possible. So this is a relationship-focused family engagement strategy that involves catching kids being good in the classroom context, supporting teachers with that specific strategy, and then communicating that specific positive behavior that the teacher observed to parents so that they get that need met of knowing what's happening with their student in their classroom. This is a light touch intervention, a nudge, you could say, or a stealth intervention, in that it's meant to be tiny. You might not even know that an intervention is happening, because this additional communication that I'll explain in a moment is really the only aspect of this intervention. It's very small and light touch. So the intervention itself involves teachers adding 2 or more weekly positive contacts to parents of a specific target child in their classroom. Could be more than one child, but the goal is to keep this number low so that it's efficient while also being effective. My research team for our pilot study has worked a lot to create sample scripts that align with Tier 1 PBIS expectations, which I'll show you in a moment, and no other modifications were made to classroom practices. Parents were not asked to do anything differently, and the only thing that teachers were asked to do was to catch students being good and then use these sample scripts provided by us as part of the intervention to communicate those examples to families through those positive shout outs. So it's praise plus teacher-parent communication, and that's really the extent of the intervention. Next. So the goal here is to improve relationships among this triad of teacher, parent, and the child or student themselves. So between the teacher and the child, we're increasing praise or positive attention through that catch them being good strategy, and hopefully improving perceptions of this relationship for both parties. Between the teacher and parent, the goal is to improve communication, with the secondary goal of hopefully also improving perceptions of trust or alliance in that dyad. Lastly, between the parent and the child, we hope that the parent will engage in communication about these positive shout outs with their child, and therefore increase their praise, and hopefully also increase the perception of the teacher and the school in this parent-child dyad. So there's a lot going on in this very simple intervention, and we targeted triads within our pilot study that I'll get into in a moment, in that we recruited teachers who were willing to participate, who then identified a child who had Tier 2 behavioral needs, and their parents were then involved in the intervention as well. Next. So more about who is involved in this intervention. It is very much developed from a prevention lens. So our pilot study, as you'll notice in a few moments, is with elementary school students from that earlier is better mentality. However, we would like to pilot this with older students too, and believe that this would be effective with older students as well. This is conceptualized as a Tier 2 strategy, meaning we're targeting students with some challenging behavior or mental health concerns, not those with the most significant needs, but not those with no behavioral needs either. And my hypothesis behind this is that perhaps for the students on the lower end of the continuum related to behavioral challenges, this could be enough to change their trajectory, to get that increased positive feedback about their behavior in the classroom and increased communication between home and school. This could be enough to prevent further escalation of symptoms or behavioral problems and increase that positive communication for their educational journey. Then for students who are more further along on this behavioral continuum and have more challenging behaviors, this may not be enough, this very light touch intervention, but perhaps this is an important prerequisite before we engage families effectively in other evidence-based behavioral strategies. Many of our evidence-based approaches for individuals with challenging behavior involve connections between home and school. So I've conceptualized positive parent contact as one way to enhance that partnership and trust, to encourage family participation in those more intensive evidence-based interventions. So there is a range of who this is for, but we would anticipate that for some students, this might not be enough and might serve instead as that launching into more intensive interventions with a better partnership between families and schools. Next. So now I'm going to get into the specifics of this intervention. And this is where the focus of our presentation about family data and family voice comes in. I call this step that is depicted in these pictures on the slide a matched preference assessment, because what we did here as a very first step, once we had teachers willing to work with us, is we asked teachers, what are your most preferred communication strategies with families? So we had teachers rate their top 3 methods of communication that they found to be acceptable. And then we put it in families' hands to choose from that list of 3 acceptable methods, which was most preferred for them. So we use teacher preferences and parent preferences in identifying the specific method of communication that would be used for the positive parent contact scripts. Interestingly, in our small pilot study that included 5 triads within a single case experimental design, all 5 parents chose email. So the pilot data that I'll present is just from email, but we still think that this matched preference assessment step of the intervention is a very important one. Next. So here's an example of one of the scripts that we provided to teachers that connects to their specific PBIS expectations at Tier 1 within their school. So this particular school used the acronym CARE, Cooperation, Accountability, Respect, and Empathy. And you can see that this sample script directly links to their Tier 1 acronym to provide that repeated exposure to those positive behavioral expectations for the student and also for the teacher and parent. So in order to set teachers up for success with this small scale intervention, we did engage in about 30-minute conversation of teacher training about what this communication should look like in order to align with this positive parent contact strategy. So I already mentioned the catch them being good aspect. We encourage teachers to look for real examples of positive behavior from this student in their classroom. We encouraged teachers to be very specific and genuine with their praise, to report the specifics of what they saw when they caught the student being good to parents directly. We encourage teachers to use our scripts and to ensure that this was linked to their school-wide PBIS expectations. Very importantly, we trained teachers to ensure that these communications did not place any demand on families, as that was a central component of the intervention. So they did not include questions in the emails. They did not ask for a reply from the parents. That was very central to this communication. We trained teachers to have this be genuine and varied. So we provided them with at least 5 scripts and then encouraged them to elaborate beyond those scripts to make sure that these communications were varied. And this happened 2 times a week minimum. And most teachers stuck to that 2 times a week criteria. Next. Here's a few additional scripts. Each time I talk about this intervention, people really want to see these scripts and get concrete about how this could be used in their school. I encourage you to take this practice and run with it. So these scripts are from a school where the expectations were bark, be responsible, achieve excellence, respect self, others, and property, and keep safe. And again, very simple, to the point, encouraging specific behavior praise in a way that's communicated to families, but linked to those school-wide expectations. Next. And this positive parent contact strategy is aligned with common Tier 2 systems features within PBIS. Perhaps most directly, it's a way to acknowledge appropriate behavior in a way that is consistent with school-wide expectations and interventions. This is also an opportunity for increased adult support by engaging teachers and families. And it's a way to provide frequent feedback for specific targeted behaviors in that it aligns with those school-wide PBIS expectations. Next. So I'm going to briefly introduce the pilot study and walk through some of the data that we've been able to gather across these 3 primary questions. The first being, whether there is a relationship between this positive parent contact intervention that, as I just described, includes communication between parents and teachers, teachers to parents actually. And we wanted to know, will this have an impact on classroom behavior for the students? So we measured and observed on-task classroom behavior to see if positive parent contact may be enough to move the mark on student behavior, despite students not being a central focus of this specific intervention strategy beyond the catch them being good aspect. Secondly, we wanted to know, did this intervention approach, the positive parent contact, contribute to reciprocal communication between parents and teachers? So we didn't ask parents to reply, but did they, as a natural outcome of this increased communication from teachers to parents? And lastly, we wanted to know if this intervention was acceptable to parents and teachers, which of course is very important if we're trying to design an intervention that is by nature very high reinforcement and low demand. So that acceptability data was very important to us as well. Next. So on the next 3 slides, I have data to answer each of those questions. So this first slide is presenting our data for on-task behavior. And I'm really happy to report that our visual analysis and effect size estimates both indicate that this intervention had a moderate positive effect on classroom behavior. I'm excited about this because this shows that enhancing communication and partnership between home and school might be enough to begin to improve positive classroom behavior for students we work with. So that's just another of many rationales for family-school partnership. We also collected fidelity data to make sure that teachers were able to engage in those 2 or more positive contacts a week, and generally had high fidelity across participants, with the lowest being 70% for the middle graph here, where there were a few times where the communications were missed, but we still saw some positive response. Next. So these data are about whether or not parents responded or reciprocated the communications that came from teachers. I'm happy to report that 4 of the 5 teacher participants reported that parents responded to the emails. So more so than the 0 levels of communication at baseline. So that was a bit discouraging that baseline levels of communication really were that low. But teachers reported that parents responded to an average of 63% of the positive parent contact communications, ranging from 33% of emails to 88%, without ever asking them to respond. So by teachers reaching out, parents then perhaps saw this open door for communication and began to have more reciprocal communication, despite the fact that that was not a built-in element of this intervention. Additionally, 4 of the 5 parents initiated additional contacts with teachers outside of the emails by coming into the school to talk to the teachers and initiating other methods, phone calls or emails that were outside of these scripted positive parent contacts. Next. And I see a question about sample size. This was a single case experimental design with five triads. This was our initial acceptability data. So we had an acceptability survey with numbers that indicated that we were in the highly acceptable range. On this slide, I chose to just pull a few quotes from teachers and parents from our small pilot study to indicate some of the themes here. So teachers in general thought that it was very easy to implement and required very little time. One teacher even told us that she didn't think this should count as an intervention because it was so small compared to what she was usually asked to do for students with behavioral challenges. And then another quote that a teacher was more deliberate and playful about her communication with this family because she was looking for specific positive behavior in the classroom. And then parents indicated that it was nice and a timely way to receive positive feedback and hear what was going well, and that it provided another channel for collaboration. Next. So to conclude, these initial data, as well as some informal implementation efforts with schools that I'm partnering with in more of a consultant role, We have seen that increasing positive communication from teachers to parents may have a positive effect on classroom behavior and on reciprocal communication between teachers and parents. So there's some outcomes related to student behavior as well as partnership between families and schools. Additionally, when we plan for the preferences and needs of parents and ask them about how they would like to communicate and consider reinforcement rather than just thinking about what they can do for us, that those really lead to high acceptability data and potential for increased buy-in or likelihood of implementation of more comprehensive behavioral interventions, which are often involved in tier 2 and tier 3 of our PBIS systems. Lastly, school to home communication may be an important active ingredient. As we know, this is a very common part of many behavioral interventions, including check-in, check-out, daily behavioral report cards. So the goal of our work is to really see if this alone could be enough for some students. And that concludes my brief introduction of this strategy to you all. Like I said, I encourage you to go out there and use it. I unfortunately am not going to be able to stick around for the final session of questions. If you go to the next slide, this will show my email address. If you have any additional questions or want more information about this project, please feel free to email me. And now I will pass the torch to Chris with our final presentation in our series. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everybody. So as you can see from the slide here, we're moving into tier 3. We talked some about tier 1 and then about tier 2, communication and family engagement and how to use data to help share what we're doing and foster communication with positive behavior support. And now we're moving into tier 3. I just want to note here that tier 3, we think of that as separate from everything else that we're doing, but we really should be thinking about these all together, right? So tier 3 goes hand in hand with what we're doing at tiers 1 and 2, just as we have students who, we don't have tier 3 students and tier 2 students. We have students that might need just universal support. Some might need more targeted or individualized support at some areas. Here again, we're thinking about all of this together and how our tier 3 system should complement other tiers and not be independent from these. Slide. And a quick disclaimer with what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. I will share some examples from research and practice that we did using Prevent, Teach, and Reinforce for families. And while the examples might have some specific documents, it's really not about the documents or about PTR or Prevent, Teach, Reinforce. It's really about the concepts. And so what I'm really talking about today are the concepts that are could be applied without any particular intervention package. I will say, though, that PTR is a manualized approach that uses a PBS framework, so it encapsulates evidence-based approaches to assessment and intervention, and person-centered, or in this case, family-centered manner that uses team-based decision-making. Slide. Okay, so where do families fit in tier 3? As you guessed probably by now, families shouldn't be contacted initially at this level, but family engagement is part of what we should be doing universally and with our more targeted interventions. And so when and if a student needs support that's more intensive or individualized, there's already some communication and there's some bridge there between the family and the school. If students entering tier 3 without that, then there is really little room or little time for building a relationship that could be beneficial for collaboration and for building consistency across settings. So it's really vital that before here we have some initial bridge, and then we move into as needed. And again, this is with that 3 to 5% of students, more individualized support. Next slide. Okay, so we're talking about data this afternoon and how we might use data to inform practices in family engagement and in student support. Data can be complicated, but they certainly don't have to be complicated. And when it comes to family engagement at Tier 3, it's really better that they're not complicated and that they're easy for us to collect, certainly whether it's within a school or from the family's end data, and easy to understand and easy to share. It's really vital that we all understand and have an agreement about the idea of what behavior is and can describe accurately what's going on. And certainly data can help us to do that, whether it's qualitative, more descriptive data of this is what's going on, or the actual numbers, which we often think of as the data. Next. So Tier 3 support, specifically around behavior, has a number of steps, and there are opportunities to collect data across each step of Tier 3 intervention, from our early identification to teaming, to assessment, to intervention and evaluation. The key idea here is that you're aware and you're thinking about how you might collect information to inform your practices, and you do so in a way that makes sense to your setting, to the team, to classrooms, and to families, and you do so in a way that's contextually relevant, so that that's a good fit, that's not going to be too overly intrusive, but gets the information that you need and shares that. Next slide. Great. Of course, you're already using data to identify students who might require more intensive intervention, whether that's Tier 2 or Tier 3 in particular areas. And so hopefully, again, Tier 3 isn't your first point of contact with families, but as we connect with families to talk about individualized support and intervention, there are a lot of opportunities to gather information that will help us along the path of building individualized support plans that will work for our students. In PTR, we talk about family goal setting as a first step, prior even to FBA or behavior assessment. It's more formalized in that application, but it certainly doesn't need to be. Really, the take home is that we gather information about the family's perspective on the child and about behavior, and that helps us to ensure that we're as much aligned as possible. And we understand where the family's coming from, we understand their goals, we understand their perspective on the behavior, what resonates with them. And then we use, in turn, language that resonates with everybody who's at the table. Next. So here's some examples of powerful questions that might begin those meaningful conversations. The information that we gather with these sort of questions is really qualitative in nature. And I know that when we think of data and the kind of data that we often like are the numbers, but this qualitative information will really help us to form a better understanding of family perspective. So in addition to, or really before you ask questions that get at the function of behavior, we might ask these questions in order to get that family perspective. And then again, all of these questions are just examples, but they're ones that have proven to be powerful questions in gathering valuable insight and demonstrating that we also value the family's perspectives. And hopefully that's a genuine sort of demonstration that we're really appreciating the family perspective on behavior and again on intervention planning around that. Next. So part of the conversation at tier 3 is defining the goal or the goals. So before we can really get at what's going on with a particular behavior, how are we going to address it, we need to have a general agreement of what it is that we're looking at. And generally with positive behavior support, we don't only identify a behavior of concern or an undesired behavior, but also another behavior that we'd like to see more of. And so that could be a functionally equivalent behavior, like something that fulfills the same need for the student. It could also be something that increases social skills or otherwise can make a challenging behavior unnecessary. This is an opportunity here at this juncture to have conversation and to assure, again, alignment with families to make sure that we're in agreement about what these goals are. Their goals at home might be different from those that are at school, but having that conversation can only help us to find those commonalities and to come to some agreement about those goals. Next. So we might be accustomed to collecting and using data as part of an FBA BIP process. And in the classroom, we might be gathering day-to-day or even hour-to-hour information. As we know, when we go to tier 3, we typically are gathering information a lot more frequently and looking at that a lot more frequently. And so we might be getting a lot of information, again, in the classroom about when behavior is occurring, where it's happening, with whom, what typically precedes it, what typically follows or reinforces the behavior. And we don't always do a good job of communicating that with families, either helping them to understand what's going on, or, well, I should say and, not just or, getting that information from families, but doing that in a way that makes sense to them. And it's even less likely that we get those sort of data from families. With PTR, we found some ways to do what we call practical data collection, and I'll share that here in a second. But it's important to get an idea of what's going on, of course, as you build your individualized interventions, and to have some data that drives those decisions. We might primarily look at school data, but we might have opportunities to it. It might be beneficial for us to also get information that's more data information from families if we're going to build something that maybe goes across contexts. Next slide. So here's an example, as I just alluded to, of a data sheet that we use. And some of you may have seen similar or used similar. This is the behavior rating scale, or BRS, and it's very simple. Again, this might be too simple for what we might be doing in the classroom for tier 3, but it's been very practical in family home settings and in the community, in that it just requires, and again, we're focused on the desired behavior and the undesired behavior. It just requires one entry potentially per day, or during that really problematic time of where was the student or the child, depending on home or school, where were they at? Were they 5 being the best day we could hope for, or 1 being the more along the lines of the worst? So we have anchors that we set up with the family. And again, it's more just a matter of setting it up and then maybe 5 minutes at most, or even a couple minutes a day of getting that information. And again, this might not be practical for everyone, but we found it very useful with families that participate, in which we build something that goes across those settings. Next slide. And so here you just see an example of one that's filled out, and this is for younger, I think kindergarten maybe. So the context might not be a match for your students, but it's, again, the idea of having something that's very practical. And you see an example of how we built anchors on that 5-point scale for both sets of behaviors. Next slide. So when we talk about tier 3 for behavior, oftentimes we think right away about FBA and BIP, because that's a central part often of our tier 3 for behavior. We could spend all day talking about that. I'm not going to do that because we don't have that kind of time. But just to point out, as we collect information or data, that we're cognizant of family-friendly language and the questions that we ask. If we're getting information from them to help build behavior intervention plans, that it resonates with them. And so here's an example again of a family form that includes those sort of, so does this behavior occur during doctor or dentist visits, or when watching television? These are things you might not have in a classroom FBA form, but you might find useful here. Next slide. A couple of things to note about data and discussions at the tier 3 level, where data is so important. Of course, we use data across all 3 levels, but it's really vital to have good data here. First, we're talking about data from families and to families. And so we want to, first of all, have a bidirectional, so we're sharing what's going on in school. Hopefully we're getting information about what's going on at home as well, or in the community, and make sure that we're doing this in a form and in a method that works for everyone. So how brief is it? Hopefully we're not sharing too much, but sharing the relevant information. Are we doing it via text or email, or what method? And then what do we do with the data? We need to have a way to, because that's not the end point, what are we doing with them? There are a number of questions that we can ask of the data, and that will dictate then our follow-up, whether it's to classrooms or families. Next slide. Along these lines, one other thing I want to share around data at tier 3 that's vital is fidelity. And we know that when we implement something that's individualized, that there can be a lot of moving parts that are different than what's going on with other students. And so we try to do a good job with fidelity at school in the classrooms, hopefully. Similarly, we can do that with home. And so for PTR, we developed something, again, that's very simple, that is filled out for families. They can check yes or no, and then there's room for comments there. But it's vital that we have this, because otherwise, if it's not working, we don't know if it's because we didn't pick the right intervention, or because we're just not implementing it well. Next slide. And so here's an example of some data, very simple, from the BRS, the Behavior Rating Scale. And one of the nice things we found about using something like this is that when we use a 5-point scale like this, that it tends to graph itself. And so we can see, and the people who are implementing can see right away and get reinforced by what they're doing here. Again, it might not be enough detail for what's going on in the classroom, but for families, it can be very powerful. And then it provides some launching point for discussion, for follow-up, coaching, any other sort of reassessment of what's going on, depending on whether the student is responding or not responding. Next slide. So one more thing that I want to share as I wrap up talking about tier 3 data and family engagement around data. So we talked about what we're building for tier 3. Is it working? Is it not? That's the implementation. That's one layer of data. Then fidelity is what we're trying to do. Are we actually doing it? And then we're looking at those 2 levels of data. We also should be cognizant about how we're supporting the implementers. And that's an additional layer. So whether the implementer is a family member or a teacher or staff, that we have some way of ensuring that those people are getting that support. And so here's an example, again, from our work, of a very basic checklist to ensure that we're providing that follow-up, we're providing that problem solving if need be, that we're having those conversations and ensuring that the ball is rolling with tier 3 support. And I think, next slide. Yep, I think that's it for me. So I'm going to turn it back to Andy.
Great, thanks everyone for these great presentations, and it's been nice to follow the conversation in the chat. Appreciate everyone's comments and questions as we've moved through. We have a few minutes remaining for questions and discussion. I've recorded a few that might get us started, but I encourage you to please add any other questions, thoughts, or wonderings that you have in the chat as we focus on finishing up our session today. So one question, Adam, was I think this referred to some of the work that you described about, and I think there was a question about funding, and was wondering what kind of funding support perhaps you've had to support some of the work that you described relative to use of the Family School Practices Survey and work with the school teams.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So that's a great question. So when it comes to funding, the academy work that's done across the state of Massachusetts is funded by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Ed, the Department of Education there. So that kind of provides the funding to have the kind of academy work that gets done for those schools. So definitely is state funded, and with that, we meet on a regular basis and kind of talk about kind of what the needs are, and kind of equity is one of those big things that they are focusing on. And so as always, they're kind of curious about, how can we improve the work that we do? And so it was great to be able to kind of utilize that survey to help the schools think about the work that they're doing with engaging families and involving families with this work, and also kind of build that into their action plans. So funding source was definitely through the state.
Thanks, Adam. One other question was, just sort of thinking about how the Family School Practices Survey was completed. Now it's, my understanding that school teams completed that survey as sort of a self-assessment. I'm wondering, to the extent that that's true, and then also whether there were any family members, as part of those teams who were providing input about the, the ratings and the reflection that the team went through about the practices that they were engaging in.
Yes, that's also a lovely question. It's so good. I love the questions around making sure that families are included, because that's such an important piece. We encourage that our school teams have one or two family members that are not parents of kids that are not teachers at the school, basically. So with that, we're hoping that they have one or two family members. Do I say that all of our teams do that? Definitely not. We're working on this. We're encouraging them to have family members on their teams as much as possible. So I'm certain that some of them did, but not all of them likely. So I think that's a great piece, especially as you're trying to generate ideas around how we collaborate with our families. It's such an important piece is to have families there to really kind of brainstorm and problem solve the best ways of communication, sharing information, making decisions. So that's key. So yeah, I think it's great to have the families there. So basically the school teams completed it, and it was the way that we have it scheduled is that we have it in the springtime. We also do a couple other school fidelity measures across it, so we try not to survey them too much, but we need, it's always nice to have these checklists to help us guide us in our action planning, just to make sure we're thinking about all the different things we need to think about. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Adam. Going over to you, Chris. I think there are a few questions in the chat about your most recent session. I will just mention, I noticed a few questions about the Family School Practices Survey. We were able to add that to the files section of Pathable, so that should be available for download now at this point, in addition to the link to the survey that was shared earlier. So I just wanted to point people to that in case you didn't get a chance to see that yet. So Chris, I think there are maybe a couple questions about some of the work that you reviewed. And I think first, I wonder if you'd be willing to talk a little bit more about how you, or in the context of PTR, family values and expectations at home are sort of sought out or incorporated at the early stages of this, and what that two-way sort of relationship-based process looks like with families at the early stages of that process.
Sure, sure. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and something that there's so much to cover, I think, in a small amount of time. But I think one of the reasons why, or I don't think, but one of the reasons why we have early on these discussions about the family goals and dreams and about goal setting is to ensure that we're aware of family perspective and family values and also family preferences with regards to how we talk about behavior, how we think about behavior. Not that we're deviating from the sort of behavioral framework, but it's helpful to have and to be respectful of some of the family's perspectives on the behavior and then what their expectations are at home. And that's depending on the situation. So PTR, which I use as the example in here, was used not just by schools, but also by caseworkers or people in early childhood programs, and then oftentimes in elementary schools and then other non-school settings. And so depending on the venue, the amount that we talk about, not that we're going to broach like that this is what needs to happen at home, but even talk about that might vary depending on the setting. So if it's used by child welfare, then there might be a little bit more discussion about that. Certainly not with schools as much, but with schools, it's more of getting a perspective of where the family's at, where their goals are, and then seeking to find alignment there. And certainly I've had families that have been provided a lot of helpful information about who they like to hear from and how they like to hear from people about these topics, and who's the best person there to communicate with. Hopefully we get information from, we don't talk about parents. We don't use the word families because our primary contact might be an uncle or aunt or a provider or a grandparent. And so this early on provides an opportunity to get a lot of this information that just helps to guide our work, I think, in a nutshell. Is that helpful? I guess I should ask the person who asked the question, but I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, please feel free to add in the chat if you have any follow-up questions about that topic. Chris, I think one other thought was about getting started with PTR. So if is the manual only available for purchase? Are there ways to access any of the forms or materials that you're aware of? Or more generally, what might your suggestions be for getting started with using PTR with families? Yeah, well, and so again, I use that to help frame some of the discussion. Certainly this isn't about using PTR in general. You can use any of the concepts that we talked about today without using any specific manualized intervention. But the book is published through Brooks Publishing, so I don't have a secret code for everyone to go in and get. You'd have to get it through Brooks. But once it's purchased, there are all the forms that I shared are available electronically through their website as well. And a lot of these are, if you look at the slides, you can develop something quite similar without, using your own, whatever you're using. If you're interested in having something that helps organize goal setting or a simple behavior rating scale, of course, we didn't invent that by any means. So it's just part of this package. So That's a great point, Chris, that so many of these, concepts and topics are easily adaptable and reformatted into, creating something that works well for, an individual family or teacher that you might be working with.
Yeah.
As you, maybe this is sort of a question for both Adam and Chris, as you're sort of considering information about working with families and how that dynamic might change a bit at sixth grade, or maybe some of the upper, grade school levels relative to some of the lower elementary school levels. Have you encountered any ideas or tips or suggestions that you might be willing to share about how some of the concepts that you described today could apply at an early elementary level versus a middle childhood or middle school level or beyond?
Is that question for me?
I think for either of you, just as you're sort of thinking about maybe these individualized strategies or strategies that might be applied at a broader systems or school-wide level, are there any considerations that you might think of that might take that developmental level or school context into consideration?
Yeah, I think oh, go ahead, Adam.
No, go ahead. I'll jump in after you.
Okay. Well, I think as far as what I shared, the basic framework, and I tried to boil it down to the framework because I think it's something that's applicable across these grade levels. But of course, within that, there are considerations, and certainly jumping in from pre-K to elementary and beyond. But say with goal setting, who's involved with goal setting? If this is with an older, with middle high schooler, they're involved hopefully in some of that conversation. And as you saw with an FBA, your questions are going to be very different. So there's a lot to consider around there. I didn't get into the nuts and bolts of that because I think we try to stay at the, here's some bigger ways to organize your thinking around data and around tier 3 family engagement. But the nuts and bolts will change quite a bit from across the grade levels, certainly. And then the intervention planning, again, you have, maybe the student is taking much more collaborative role in that. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that maybe at younger grades, families are much more willing to kind of enter the school. And then as the kids get older, they become a little bit less so, and that could be a struggle. But I think the main point is really kind of similar to what Chris said, is really try and use the framework in a sense of try and engage families, there's so many different ways to do that, through surveys, through different meetings. I love the idea in the previous presentation around focus groups, and listen to what they're telling us about how the communication system really could be. And I find that it really, if you can use those communication systems, figure out whatever works for them, whether they prefer social media or they prefer different video chats or, face-to-face. I think, that's something that I'm always learning about, what works best for you. And I think one of the things that I really loved from the previous presenters too around this content was really that disaggregating that by subgroup, and making sure that we are really making sure that all groups of families have opportunities to get engaging. So not just look at the majority. So I think that's just another wonderful idea. So as much as we can, I think we need to learn from our families so they can kind of guide us in this work.
Well, I think that's a really important point, and appreciate those comments, Adam and Chris, and such a nice note to to end on that, that really the focus is on centering on family and student voice and using that, using their voice in the plans and procedures that we create, whether it's at school-wide, tier 2 or tier 3. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and we really appreciate your participation and discussion. Our contact information is listed here on the slide. Feel free to get in touch with us with any follow-up questions or conversation. We'd love to speak with you, and as included in the chat, please also complete the evaluation when you have a moment.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.